There's no such thing as a Brontosaurus. That actually is true. That scientists have, that there is no such thing. I think it's like an Apatosaurus or something.
Welcome to the Mockingcast, the podcast of Mockingbird Ministries. I'm David Zoll, your host, and in just a few moments, I'll be joined by my co-hosts, Sarah Condon and RJ Heyman. We come to you every other Friday to explore a few of the places where we currently see grace and its absence playing out in unexpected and compelling ways. We're glad to have you with us.
Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. God of all.
Back at you, all three reunited. I am so happy to see RJ, your smiling face through the computer screen. We've missed you.
RJ, are you gonna sing it?
Wait, sing what?
United and it feels so. I was like, when is RJ gonna kick in with the song?
Well, we had a little computer glitch there for a second. I didn't hear what you said. I would have probably. So I was saved by my internet connection.
Well, do you have anything we've missed you, so what do you have to report? Anything to share?
What do I have to report? I'm 43 years old. Had my birthday. Got my 14-year-old son confirmed. I haven't seen Sarah in a while, so her hair is longer than it used to be. She's enjoying college ministry. I'm sure that a fluorescent dye job is in the near future and a nose ring. I don't know. I mean, the sauna and the flood have returned to Houston. We had a little rain the other day that flooded out 2,000 cars. No big deal. Just what happens. Just an average Tuesday in Houston.
Oh my goodness, really?
Yeah, really.
What do you think of the fact that people are referring to Aaron as a poor man's RJ Heyman?
Really?
Aaron Zimmerman is a poor
like he's a rich man's RJ
Heyman. I started that hashtag on Twitter, so I don't know. It's been, I've missed you guys. It's wonderful to be back. I will say that. And I know Aaron did a wonderful job in my set. I'm just keeping the seat warm for him, let's be honest.
Oh, shush.
But it's good to be back.
I'm so glad to be back with you guys, and we got a lot to talk about today. And RJ, I can't wait to hear your insights on these things as well as yours, Sarah. We have the first thing up is Soraya Roberts wrote something fascinating for Medium that a bunch of people sent me called "When Did Pop Culture Become Homework?" When did pop culture become homework? She writes, "I didn't do my homework last weekend. Here was the assignment. Beyonce's Homecoming. A concert movie with a live album tie-in, which I knew I was supposed to watch, not just as a critic, but as a human being. But I didn't." Then she goes on to say, "Pop culture right now has become a rolling curriculum for the general populace, which determines whether you make the grade as an informed citizen or not. I'm not saying there are a bunch of professors at lecterns telling us to watch Game of Thrones, but there are a bunch of networks and streaming services that are doing that, and viewers and critics following suit, constantly telling us what we have to watch or must listen to or should read. Essentializing any form of art limits it," Soraya Roberts writes, "setting parameters on not only what we are supposed to receive, but how. But this increasingly moralistic approach to culture, quote, robs us of what is messy, intense, and chaotic and extrajudicial about art. Now, instead of approaching everything with a sense of curiosity, we approach with a set of guidelines. Creating art to dominate this discursive landscape turns that art into a chore. In other words, cultural homework. This is where people start saying things like, do I have to watch Captain Marvel? And feeling a lot of pressure right now to read Sally Rooney. This kind of coercion has been known to cause an extreme side effect, ding, 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 reactance, a psychological phenomenon in which a person who feels their freedom being constricted adopts a combative stance, turning a piece of art we might otherwise be neutral about into an object of derision. The Guardian's Oliver Berkman, who we love, called it cultural cantankerousness, talking about how people try to balance feeling included and feeling distinct within a social group. So pop culture as homework. Did this ring any bells for you guys? What are you with this article?
So many bells. The last thing you said was a total like Harry Potter moment for me. Because, I was in seminary at a place that thinks it looks like Harry Potter. I don't even know what that means. But everyone would like use Harry Potter references. They're like, I'm in the house of Brontosaurus or whatever. You know what I mean? And I was always just like,
There's no such thing as a Brontosaurus. That actually is true. That scientists have there is no such thing. I think it's like an apatosaurus or something.
But
There's
is
no
it
such thing
in
as a
Harry
Brontosaurus.
Potter? Like, are we
Nope.
sure?
It's a house Gryffindor,
Gryffindor,
Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, and Slytherin. How
I'm
dare
just
you
like-
transgress?
Hufflepuff.
I know. I just was always like a little because everyone said you have to like you're an Episcopal seminary and like you have to know Harry Potter. I was always like, I'm not reading that. You know what I mean? I had very sort of aggressive. And I actually tend to do that about a lot of pop culture things. So like Game of Thrones. I've never watched Game of Thrones, but I mean, there are things like definitely Beyonce stuff. Like I am always surprised when people like aren't up on it, and I'm married to someone who's never up on it. But I'm always like I picked our kid up from school a couple of weeks ago, and I walked in and they had these like yellow bags with like stuff. I don't know. It was like stuff in them, free toys or something. And the teacher was like, "Oh, it's Lemonade Day." And in my brain, I was like, "Whoa, I didn't know there's so many Beyonce fans in this school." But they meant like real lemonade. And I came home and told my husband, and he had no idea what I was talking about. So, you know, I mean, I definitely resonated with this like burden of the things we should know about. And also that like greater the law, the greater the trespass. Like you tell me I have to know about it and I'm going to like I'm going to make you feel bad for knowing about it.
Like there's a certain type of person that then like doubles down and tries to be up on absolutely everything and drives themselves crazy. And then there's a certain type of person who says, I will watch everything but that. Because I feel like I'm being graded and that it's an obligation. And once it becomes, I look to art, pop culture in order to escape my obligations and to feel some sense of, transporting effect out of escapist life, of the demands of life. And then now that when they follow me into that arena, you just are resentful. But what about you, RJ?
Well, I was thinking about Sarah, and I don't know, you also are constantly posting books you're reading, and it makes me feel very judged. I'm like, gosh, Sarah Condon reads so much. Do you just read all the time, Sarah? Is that kind of what you do to unwind, and is that your thing?
Yeah, I read
It would
a
make
lot.
sense, yeah. I'm like, man, Sarah Condon is reading the books. So I don't know if I'm feeling the pop
not,
culture.
though. Oh my God, I feel bad that you feel bad. Like, that sucks.
Well, you shouldn't. I mean, it's sort of part and parcel of being R.J. Heyman, so it's not your fault. But
a poor man's Aaron Zimmerman, or
it's exactly the poor man's Aaron
Exactly.
Zimmerman. But no, it made me think of my wife who hates Rotten Tomatoes. Because she's like, I don't want a website to tell me how I'm supposed to feel about a movie. I just want to watch the movie. And of course, my retort is always like, well, but why do we want to waste 2 hours watching something that's terrible? But then I also realized like my hit rate on movies that are highly rated by Rotten Tomatoes, like oftentimes I don't like those either. And so she's very good about just watching what she wants to watch. I probably feel a little more the tug of the need to self-justify. And yet the other reality is I just don't have that much time for pop culture right now. And usually when I'm talking to groups of younger people, now that I'm in my mid-40s, I'm always like double checking my cultural references. Like I was talking to a bunch of high schoolers and I was like, orange mocha frappuccino, which is a Zoolander reference. And they looked at me and they just go, that sounds gross. Like what exactly? And I was like, wow, I'm really old. So yeah, I like the pop culture, but I'm off the train a little bit because I just feel so far behind. Like, thank God I have middle schoolers because I tell them to DJ. I'm like, let's listen to your Spotify. I'm like, this is really good. Like, yeah, no, this came out like 2 years ago.
I mean, RJ, how does this make you feel? The Game Boy came out 30 years ago.
I remember in middle school, it was like the thing. So I would have been
This week. Yeah.
13 years old, like at 8th grader, probably like Christmas of my 8th grade year. It was
my
like the thing to have. Did I have one? Maybe later, not right off the bat, but yeah, I'm starting to feel old, man.
But it is also like pop culture, one of the things that we talk about, and I think a lot of times on this podcast, but also in the seculosity framework, is that a lot of these things have become increasingly moralistic, and just as comedy has become more preachy, so has a lot of this stuff. And I feel like when something is billed to me as culturally important, I want to run in the opposite direction. And my thing is always like Black Panther. I was told so many times I had to watch it, and so I still wanted to watch it because I'm a fan of the comics, but I didn't watch it until it was on Netflix, and then I watched it. I thought, this is amazing. And woe to me that I didn't watch it beforehand, but I felt it was becoming this litmus test of whether or not I was a sort of a woke on the train or not. And that was deeply alienating. And I think it's also sad for the people who put all the time in and the joy into making that when it becomes assigned. This is just how the human heart works, unfortunately.
That was like the Hotel Rwanda phenomenon, back in the day when you still got DVDs through the mail with Netflix. They said that Hotel Rwanda was the single video that people held on to longer than any other because they're like, I know I should watch this.
What?
But I
That's
really
crazy,
don't want.
RJ.
Yeah, people would have it at their house for like 30 weeks. Because it would just sit on their coffee table. They'd be like, I know I need to watch this. I really don't want to.
No one actually. We want to think of ourselves as the type of
Oh
person
my
who
gosh.
has seen Hotel Rwanda and loves Hotel Rwanda, is telling everyone about Hotel Rwanda. But at the end of the day, when we're really tired, we just want to watch reruns of Seinfeld or Friends.
Yeah.
Bravo.
And having seen Hotel
Bravo.
Rwanda, it was
Bravo.
great. And I will never watch it again.
Right.
There's certain movies you're like, that was really good.
Schindler's
I don't
List
ever
is on
need
that-
to
was
watch
on that
that
same
again.
list.
Yeah. Totally
Yeah.
agree.
Well, Berkman weighs in at the end of that from The Guardian, and he also weighed in with another piece this week, which is, I love the title of it. Let's face it, we all judge each other's relationships. This is in The Guardian. And he says, no one wants to today be found guilty of the modern sin of capital J, judging other people's relationships. Something we're reminded in article after article that we definitely shouldn't do. The notion that the private lives of others are none of our business, though it would have baffled people at most points in history, is unquestionable in ordinary context today. The thought that I might harbor an opinion about your decision to have or not have kids, the age difference in your relationship, or your open marriage seems faintly scandalous. Which is weird because the truth is that everyone's judging everyone else's relationships all the time. What we urgently seek to know, as a blog post from the School of Life, which is Alain de Botton's website, puts it, is, are other people in as much trouble as we are? Nobody with the slightest insecurity or even curiosity can possibly regard others' private lives as none of their business, since they're far too valuable a trove of data about how people cope with the challenges of being alive. And this speculation naturally takes the form of judging because, as the essayist Tim Kreider has written, and former Mockingbird speaker, we anxiously size up how everyone else's decisions have worked out to reassure ourselves that our own are vindicated, that we are, in some sense, winning. At the core of the urge to judge, this is Berkman again, is something universal and very human, the desire to get a handle on how we're doing in a world where confusion far outweighs clarity. To the extent that you're able, you're better off unhooking your happiness from external judgments rather than spending your days struggling to reassure yourself that others are judging you completely positively. Because unless they happen to have made exactly the same life choices as you, they almost certainly aren't doing so. Boom.
I feel like when I read this, I avoided that last part. Now I'm stuck in that. That's heavy.
You mean you think basically that other people are inevitably judging your own
Yeah,
choices?
I mean, because
If you're breathing, you're judging.
If you're breathing, no, no, and I know that, but there's also this thing. I mean, especially because we live in a neighborhood where most mothers don't work, and so there's always a bit of awkwardness in conversation around the fact that I do, and I don't know. I mean, there's I'm just oh gosh, I guess sometimes maybe they talk about that when I'm not around. Shit.
You better believe they do.
Yeah.
No question.
She looks so tired today. Did you see her?
There's no way she can be paying attention to those kids
I know,
enough.
I know. It's and these are lovely people, but lovely people judge other lovely people, right? That is the reality of who we are. It does strike me it's the same way we talk about when people die. We're always well, how did they die? You know what I mean? Because it's always how can I avoid death?
Or how is it their fault somehow that they...
Right,
that they...
exactly. What did they do wrong to deserve this? I mean, it's a very similar thing. But I think it's also why, and Dave, you and I have talked about this before, when you have a circle of good friends, when you're a young parent and you've got a group of friends who are in that kind of same boat as you, when one of those couples gets divorced, it's like, because there's this element of like, oh my God, like as much as you want to define yourselves over and against all of these couples, and you probably, like, if you're anything like us, have like these like late night conversations in the kitchen where there's like a glass of, Chardonnay, and you're like, well, they don't seem to have it together like we do. Like suddenly, you see them get divorced and you face that reality that actually you're very similar. You know what I mean? And it's terrifying.
And I love his honesty, the rawness with which he writes, because he's totally right. Is everyone struggling as much as I am? Am I winning? How am I doing? How am I comparing? Looking around, judging. How can I justify my existence? It's just 100% true. And I don't know. I guess in those moments when we find that maybe for like a second we're not doing that, and we're just actually engaged in our life on a day-to-day basis, is we know we're actually doing okay. But they're few and far between.
Yeah, but this desire for a verdict is so deeply ingrained, and the sort of constant refrain to just stop judging other people, it doesn't work. I mean, I wish it did, and even Jesus says, "Judge not, lest you be judged." But the gospel answer to that law of "Thou shalt not judge" is really that someone has been judged in your place, and that's why this when you hear people sort of disparage substitutionary atonement, you want to say, well, this is the pastoral emphasis of it, because everyone is looking for a judgment, and everyone is looking for a verdict. I wish they weren't. It would be nice if they weren't. This is all. I can't help but think about it, and of course, I'm thinking about it in terms of the book that I wrote, and that this sense of enoughness. We look to other people's relationships to strengthen, to bolster, or somehow tear down our own enoughness. So if we're feeling terrible about ourselves, we'll look at someone's marriage and say, "Oh, they're so happy and they're so great. Why can't you be more like her or him?" And or if we feel if we're sort of differently inclined, then we use them to sort of tear them down to feel better about ourselves. But this jockeying for self-justification, I in a lot of the interviews I've been asked about the book, is like, why are you not talking about idolatry? Rather, you're talking about enoughness. I said, well, this book is not. I'm interested in self-justification, not worship. They're slightly different. There's a lot of resonance, but self-justification is at the heart of what I consider to be the religious impulse, rather than simply worship, or at least that's the angle this is taking. And Sarah, I mean, one of the things we've also, the three of us have talked about, is that among parents, we judge the hell out of each other's parenting. The second the door closes on the play date, that is where you're going. And the seculosity of parenting doesn't exist among our children competing. It exists among parents, and the judgments of other parents that we're afraid of. And that's where the jockeying and the exhaustion and the resentment and the sadness and loneliness and rage kind of plays in. So
also, like, no one wins. I think that's really important to say with judgment, is that even when you feel like the victor, like even when you've determined that there's this couple that and they're headed towards divorce. Like there's a couple that I sort of know peripherally in the community, and like they are like real unpleasant people to be around, to be honest with you. And I've seen them in several settings and meetings and stuff. And anyway, I found out recently that they were getting divorced, and I was like, wow, I just feel worse for them now. You know what I mean? Like, there's not really any sense. Like, for a long time, there was like, oh, I bet they're horrible to each other. And then you're like, oh my God, they are horrible to each other. Like, it doesn't make you feel any better, you know?
No.
It's like, judgment is an incredibly human impulse. And so I don't want to say, like, you can't tell people not to judge, but I do think there's a little bit, RJ, you were saying, like, there are these moments when you realize you're not doing it, and I think sometimes you get more of those moments if you realize just how it doesn't help. Like, it doesn't make you feel better. It doesn't make them feel better, certainly. And when their lives fall apart, or your life falls apart, it hasn't helped, right? No one's won.
Yeah, and the least judgmental people we come across are those who've survived some kind of terrible tragedy or self-inflicted disaster.
Yeah.
And we are sort of unburdened, and the Holy Spirit, I think, is involved in this. But we all of a sudden we find ourselves loving rather than judging those whose blind spots look a lot like ours, even though
Totally.
in the form, but before that, we tend to judge those people most harshly who resemble our blind spots. But it's this kind of death and resurrection paradigm that I wish again weren't true, but seems to be of great hope for people who feel overwhelmed and oppressed by judgments, both other people's and their own.
Plus, I like this article because it introduced me to the Unimoon, which I had not heard of before.
I thought we talked about the Unimoon. Have
At
we
the
not
very
talked about the
beginning.
Unimoon?
Apparently,
Have
people who get
we've not talked about this, David Zoll.
We put it
People who get
in
married
a
and
weekender.
Well, I missed it.
unbelievable. I've just never heard. That's just unbelievable.
Tell
to me. It's
everyone
like,
what the
just
Unimoon
Tell
is.
us, RJ.
Apparently, like as if this is a real thing. You get married, and then you each go on your honeymoon by yourself after the marriage, which actually might have sounded nice to my wife because she's a fierce introvert, But I don't think so.
I don't
you
think
know?
so.
Everyone who
That's
hears it has
so-
to stifle a maybe.
Right.
Everyone who
So
hears that is like
crazy. It is the craziest thing. But the last thing, I do want to say this too, and we can edit this out if we want to. If you're struggling in your marriage right now and you're looking at other marriages being like, why aren't we like that? Go to marriage therapy. Like, do it. It'll be the best money you ever spend, and it's not always cheap, but it's money well spent. And figure yourselves out, figure out relationship, figure out your hot buttons, how to talk to each other, how to avoid conflict. Like, go to marriage therapy. It's a good thing because life is hard, man. Marriage is hard. Having kids is hard. Career is hard. And sometimes you just need an outside the perspective of a professional.
Totally agree. And if you go into marriage therapy thinking they're going to fix the other person, you're probably the problem. I mean, I don't know that from personal experience or anything, but
Sarah, that is gonna be a meme now. That is like I'm gonna personally
good.
make sure that becomes a bumper sticker.
You are so good looking.
Guys, we're gonna go from relationships into obituaries. There are two very prominent
Seamless.
Christians that died this week, and both are sort of cast a large shadow. The first is an unbelievably tragic case. And we're talking, of course, about Rachel Held Evans, who was the blogger and writer and thinker, provocateur, what have you. She was she meant a lot to a lot of people, and she has two small children and a loving husband that she left behind because of a massive swelling in her brain. And it's just a really the kind of thing that the suffering for which you have no tragedy for which we can't really put words on. But she died, and she's a controversial figure, and so it's very difficult to take for anyone of a thoughtful Christian to kind of avoid, I don't know, using this time to sort of weigh in, on what they think. Sort of, every time you hear it's like, I had a lot of disagreements, but The Atlantic, I thought, put out a tribute that captured what is appealing about Rachel. They said in her third book, Searching for Sunday, she was really looking for a space where it was okay to be broken. And she said this, and a lot of liberal progressive people are afraid of the word sin, she told Emma Green in a 2015 interview. But this is the core of Christianity, Rachel said, the bizarre truth of Christian identity. Her conviction was clear in the way she held herself in conversation, acknowledging human frailty and failings, including her own, speaking with care and humility, summoning grace for the abandoned. Later on in that article, she says, death is a thing empires worry about, not a thing resurrection people worry about. I guess she'd become a by the term resurrection people, you can tell she'd become an Episcopalian. She says, as long as there's somebody baptizing sinners, breaking the bread, drinking the wine, as long as there's people confessing their sins, healing, walking with one another through suffering, then the church is alive and it's well. The lasting legacy of Evans' writing and of her public life is her unwillingness to cede ownership of Christianity to its traditional conservative male stewards, her unwillingness to give up on Christianity, period. Now, again, I'll just say this. If you don't know who Rachel Held Evans is, and there's lots of people that don't, you'd be surprised. She was sort of grew up in a very Tennessee, I think, very evangelical upbringing. Went to an evangelical college, and then really rose to prominence during that sort of the golden age of blogging, you might say. She was extremely pithy, and I think good at getting to the heart of certain issues. And she sort of, every tribute to her talks about she sort of drifted leftward in her Christianity, and yet, of course, as the feeding frenzy on her death, as everyone wants to, analyze that and maybe lay blame or take credit, or I don't know what to say. This is a thing where I'm uncomfortable to really say much of anything. But Sarah, as someone who writes on the internet and I know has deals with people dying all the time, what do you think?
I was on the phone the other day. I called the priest, the wife of the priest I grew up with, a woman named Joan, who had a huge impact on me. And I hadn't spoken to Joan literally since I was like 17, so like almost 20 years. And she said, our group, this Bible group they're part of, has read some Rachel Held Evans, and we think she sounds so much like you. And sorry. There are certain people that define themselves against Rachel, or Rachel defined herself against them, and I at certain points definitely defined myself as someone who was not like Rachel. And death is the great equalizer, and you realize that a lot of that stuff actually didn't matter that much. It hit me like a lot harder than I would have expected it to, as someone who wasn't super into her. Like, it's just, it's been a weird thing, to be honest with you. So, I have been very moved by, I loved that she called out a lot of these, frankly, like old white guy, voices that were like at the top of evangelicalism, and they'd have these like pretty public things that, on Twitter, and, that those men have stepped forward and talked about how necessary her voice was.
That part was powerful. A couple thoughts. One was just, even though I work in a church, I think historically, and as I think about myself, I'm sounds weird to say, I'm sort of more interested in bringing the gospel to people who've never heard it before, to sort of non-Christians, than I am to preaching it to people who have heard it. But then I think that's not right, and she does, I don't know a lot about her, to be totally honest with you, but in reading this article, and then I also think about what, what's his name? Francis Spufford says in Unapologetic, how yes, Jesus was accepting, but he also didn't shy away from sin and sort of taking people to task, and he wasn't sort of a relativist, and about how, then this article, talking about how Rachel Held Evans was all about acceptance, but also about sin, and how those two things are so often, they don't go hand in hand. They seem mutually exclusive. Either you're a church of acceptance or you're a church of sin. And it's like, no. We have to be both, because Jesus is both, and life is both, and sin is the bedrock of Christian and human identity, and yet the gospel is acceptance of sinners. And so the need to hold those things together, as hard as it is, and that, people fall off the wagon on both sides, acceptance, sin. Like, am I being too accepting? Am I being too easy on sin? I mean, whatever. And you just got to go back to the Gospels over and over and over again. Like, how did Jesus do it? We're not going to do it that. We're not going to do that well. How did Paul do it? Go back to the New Testament. But those are my two thoughts.
Oh my gosh, it's definitely hard to talk about someone, a living, breathing human being with two children, and not already. We're talking about ideas as relates to the person. I don't know how to do it, but I'm grateful I have you guys to, as she says, to walk through suffering with, because it's messy and it's strange, and one wonders what it'll all look like in 15 years or 10 years, because part of me hears this and I think, having spent roughly a long time online, like what is all that online back and forth stuff actually? I know it means a lot to some people, but I also, death does put some of it in perspective in a way that is uncomfortable to me, given how much energy I've put in.
I mean, Dave, you and I talked about that. That was a very real reaction I had to this that was strange and probably needs to be edited out of this podcast. But you know, as a woman with 2 small children who spends a lot of time on the internet, yeah. I mean, there was part of me that was like, well, you know, I think about how much time I spent on the internet the first year of my daughter's birth. I literally got carpal tunnel syndrome in my right hand from my phone. You know what I mean? And I mean, yeah. I mean, there's that to what end is there also sort of the very the spiritual crisis of knowing that we spend a lot of our time there, and to what end. And certainly, like, Rachel's books are incredible, and the community she created online for people is amazing, and I do think that's worth something, but I also think we're the first generation of people who are having to ask ourselves that question. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a hard question, and it's an important one. So, you know, because all I thought about when I heard that she died was that she's a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. And I thought about how much time she probably had to spend on Twitter in arguments with people. I did. And like how much of that time she wasn't able to spend with them. And I know that's like something people will say, oh, like she was more than a mother and you're just minimizing her work and everything. But like, I'm guessing those people don't have 1-year-olds and 3-year-olds at home.
Yeah, and you can't not interpret it through your own where you're sitting. Yeah. You know, and there's a gut visceral reaction, because you're right, we have heard this outpouring of people that, and a surprise, people that I had no idea were paying attention to her, or who said, this has meant something to me. And I remember she wrote something once really nice about Mockingbird, and I feel like it's actually a lot, frankly, given even just hearing us talk about it, it's a lot easier to talk about this second person for whatever reason. Maybe it's because she is so close in age to all of us, and we see ourselves. And it's that Tim Kreider thing. It's like someone who is coming from your. It's easier to judge. It's impossible not to judge someone who looks a lot like you. And or at least
and is doing very similar work.
And so this next person, John,
and doing it better.
Well, that's a poor man's Aaron Zimmerman speaking, but. Let's talk about Jean Vanier, because he's sort of this Jean Vanier.
None of us have done anything like what this guy is doing, and I hope the Lord does not put this call on my wife. Okay, go, Dave.
This unbelievable man, a Canadian, who this funny sort of almost like from a different world. He looks a little like Tolkien always in my mind, and he's got. I watched parts of that incredible documentary about a couple of years ago. He was brought up sort of privileged, Navy family, and kind of and had this Catholic faith that really. I think he was visiting some asylums and heard the cries of the mentally disabled or people with all sorts of infirmities, and had this conversion experience, which led him to create this community called L'Arche, which is French for the Ark. And now there are something like 158 L'Arche communities where the people with various mental conditions, but I think there's a lot of sort of autism and Down syndrome, and in various states of infirmity, I guess you could say, that they all live together with other people, and these transformative, unbelievable communities. Henry Nouwen, the great writer and theologian who has impacted so many people's lives, he lived at a L'Arche community and kind of and talks about that as being his spiritual home. And my mother-in-law has been very involved in the L'Arche community in Washington, so I've gotten to hear about it over the years. And this man really was, from all accounts, the real deal. And I'll read to you from Bethany McKinney Fox wrote something for Christianity Today called Jean Vanier Made Us All More Human. She said, the Catholic theologian understood early on that L'Arche would not be a place of one-sided service, and his emphasis on true mutuality in relationships has become one of his most enduring legacies for the church. He recognized that people who are vulnerable, who experience their anguish and pain openly, are at the core of communities. In their vulnerability, they call everyone together. Over time, we all come to discover our own brokenness and fragility, realizing that they are also us. One of the things he would say is that people come to community like L'Arche because they want to help the poor. They stay in community because they realize they are the poor. She quotes Father Greg Boyle, who founder of Homeboy Industries and has written those wonderful books, who describes being deeply influenced by Vanier and L'Arche in particular, who lived out the understanding that tenderness is the highest form of spiritual maturity. In the final years of his life, Vanier was repeatedly asked the question of what he would think of being made a saint. He always dismissed the idea. He explains that he really just wanted to be a friend of Jesus, someone who exemplifies a beautiful life of love and humility, and not the pursuit of accolades and worldly success. He also said that anyone who would call for him to be a saint must not know him very well. Now, what an amazing thing and deeply Christian sentiment. I thought I'd read to you, though, to close before we speak about it. He received the Templeton Prize in 2015, and he gave some remarks about it. And he said, "I want to speak to you of what we've learned in L'Arche and Faith and Light. As you know, people with intellectual disabilities are not able to assume important roles of power and of efficacy. They're essentially people of the heart. When they meet others, they do not have a hidden agenda for power or for success. Their fundamental cry, is for a relationship, a meeting heart to heart. It is this meeting that awakens them, opens them up to life, and calls them forth to love in great simplicity, freedom, and openness. When those ingrained in a culture of winning and of individual success really meet them and enter into friendship with them, something amazing and wonderful happens. They, too, are opened up to love and even to God. They are changed at a very deep level. They are transformed and become more fundamentally human. Let me tell you about Pauline. She came to our community in 1970. Hemiplegic, epileptic, one leg and one arm paralyzed, filled with violence and rage. It was not easy to live in one of our small homes with her. Our psychiatrist gave us good insight and advice. Her violence was a cry for friendship. For so long she had been humiliated, seen as hardly human, having no value, handicapped. What was important was that the assistants take time to be with her, listen to her, and show their appreciation for her. Little by little, she evolved and became more peaceful and responded to their love. Her violence disappeared. She didn't particularly like to work in our workshops, but she loved to sing and to dance. When she was quite a bit older, I would go and visit her. Sometimes she would put her good arm on my head and she would say, "Poor old man." It takes a long time to move from violence to tenderness. The assistants who saw her initially as a very difficult person began to discover who she was under her violence and under her disabilities. They also began to change. They discovered that for a person, growth was not primarily climbing the ladder of power and success, but of learning to love people as they are. Love, in the words of St. Paul, is to be patient, to serve, to bear all, to believe all, and to hope all.
This is like a weird story to tell. I couldn't read this without thinking about my husband, not because he's done any of the things this guy has done, but when we lived in Manhattan and, we didn't really know each other when we got married and I was determined to look like a really good person. I heard that there was a shelter that had formed. So this is like 13 years ago in Manhattan that was just for transgendered kids. And I was like, we got to go volunteer at the shelter, And my husband is like, and I'm totally expecting my husband to be like, I'm not going to do that. My husband's like, okay, all right, let's do it. So like we roll into the shelter and immediately I'm like, I don't know what to do. Like, I'm like, it was like exactly how I was in CP when I was with folks there. Like, I was like, I don't know how, I can't do this. I'm not called into this. I don't know how to do it. And I remember like turning away from the group to like gather myself to be like, I just don't think I can do this. And then I turned back around and my husband was like in the middle of the kids, like talking to them. And I don't know. I don't know why. He just did it. And I say that not because I think the easy thing when we hear these stories is exactly what I'm so bad at saying French. I just leave off all the consonants at the end. Is it Vanier? Is that, am I saying it right? Yeah. Okay. I'm terrible at it. But that like he wouldn't want to be sainted because he wouldn't want people to think that they can't do this, because I do think people can do these things. I just think that like it's just a matter of being like terrified and unsure of what will happen and stepping into it. And I think that is the prayer for me as I age, that I am able to do more of those things. So maybe it's just because Josh is 5 years older than me that he was good at the shelter. But I think there's something incredible about him saying that this is not a thing that you should exclude yourself from being able to do, because it's incredible. And I mean, the other thing is being in these communities, and we have to be careful not to like romanticize or idealize people who have been born with this level of challenge, but also the way that he just described like how they are like people of the heart. I think we do feel compelled to spend time with these people and to love these people and to know these people, because to the earlier stuff we talked about, there's a profound lack of judgment. Like they aren't, you know what I mean, in this constant state of like trying to figure out why their marriage is better than everyone else's. Like they would just like to be in a relationship, period. And that's really incredible. And I promise I won't cry. This is not going to be the episode where Sarah cries the whole episode. But I cannot stop thinking about that clip from Normie, from the movie that we've shown at both of the Mockingbird conferences. And the young woman with Down syndrome, and she's watching the solar eclipse and she's watching it pass over, and she doesn't understand what's happening, and she keeps yelling at the sun to not give up.
I remember.
It's like, you know, I mean, it is our greatest blessing. And I think Vanier recognized that the way I think my husband recognized that we would actually be with these folks, you know, that we aren't the blessing to them in so many ways, but they show us that like there is actually a different way to see the world, and that there's relief in that way. So
this week I was sitting for a little while in a group of about a dozen men and women who are caring for loved ones in various stages of Alzheimer's. So it's a support group for caregivers of people with Alzheimer's. So it's spouses, maybe it's their parents. And man, it was hard to hear, and their lives are really brutal. My favorite line from that was this one woman, amazing woman, who's caring for her husband, and she's like, yep, we just keep putting one foot in front of the other on the long slog towards death.
Oh my gosh.
And everyone laughed, you know, 'cause I
Yeah.
knew exactly what she was talking about. I was just like, these people are saints, man. These people are saints. Like, this is the kingdom of God right here, because the openness, the honesty, the vulnerability, the pain, the way they supported one another, it was, and of course, nothing I would ever want for myself in a million years.
Right.
You know?
Right.
So it is the theology of the cross, you know, what we read about here with Vanier and these communities. So that's my first thought. The second one was, I remember when I was finished watching, I'm going to date myself here again, Friday Night Lights. You know, in which the main character starts off as like the head football coach at like the high school program in the state of Texas, and then moves on to UT, and then loses his job, has to take a job at another high school across town, and then eventually ends up at like a nothing high school, kind of in the middle of nowhere, football speaking. But he does it because he loves his wife. You know, he sets aside his ego kind of because he loves his wife. And I remember thinking, watching that, how the life of love is always downwardly mobile. Mm-hmm. It's the opposite of what we want, what our ego wants. And so that means two things to me. One is to have the courage and the wisdom to accept humiliation when it comes your way, because it may actually be the work of God in your life. And if you are seeking to live a life of love, to not be surprised if it's not pretty, and yet is. And so, this is an amazing article. I got to watch that documentary, but just incredible. Like what a image of escaping the law of the world. All the things that we're told will make us important and happy and valuable, when it's not true. Like, that's not what a life of joy looks like. What a life of joy looks like is what this man lived. And certainly I think that's what most people, it's what they want. But it's hard to get off the hamster wheel.
Oh my gosh,
really, really
yeah. It makes me think,
unless you're
honestly,
forced to, unless your husband comes down with dementia,
right?
Then it's
right.
like, oh, I have no choice,
right?
Yeah.
Or dies. Like I think about so much about my grandmother who, was widowed really young with 4 children and
oh my gosh.
went back to school and got got a degree to begin with, and then went on and got her master's in education, and she taught special education in a very small school in the Mississippi Delta where everyone's on food stamps, everyone's struggling. I mean, you want to talk about the least, the last, the lost, and the lonely. It's kids in special education in the Mississippi Delta. And she retired like 3 times. Like, Meemaw just kept going back. You know what I mean? And people would see her and people still say to me, it's the highest compliment when I meet somebody and they say, oh, you remind me so much of your grandmother, because, it's like, people would say, like, she's so holy and she's so she talks about Jesus so much, and it's like that, that's her survival. Like, that's how she's in this, and that's why she's in this. And so yeah, I mean, RJ, I love that. It's like no one comes by this easily. Like, and no one comes by this without losing something or giving something up. And I love that idea that, like, sometimes God does call us to, and listening to that is hard but worth it.
My response really is 2 things. Is that I recorded a podcast yesterday all about the Beach Boys, and I always find that when they talk about people of the heart, Brian Wilson always comes to mind as a person who really does have some, maybe not intellectual disability, but has dealt with a real mental illness that has kind of made him unfiltered in a way that he's seeking relationship, and the cry of his heart is sort of channeled in everything he does. At least that's what I hear, and how it communicates something so true in a world obsessed with headlines and politics and judgments. As we talked about, the cry of the heart is, do you love me? And I love you. And that is really the truth of what's really going on in life. But also, I think Pope Francis said it all when he said, all we can say about this man is we thank God that he gave this man to us, and that for his work and also his person. Not that we need to all of a sudden all become this man, but the fact that he existed at all, and that he came and these communities sprouted up, despite, I'm sure, his many limitations and hang-ups, is a work of mercy and grace and God, the Holy Spirit in the world, and to which we just say thank you. At least that's where I'm at, and I'm just going to go put on some Beach Boys and kind of think about how wonderful it is that Jean Vanier lived, and to get everyone to watch. I think it's called Summer in the Forest. It's a documentary all about him that came out only a few years ago. It's fantastic. Actually came out last year, so I'm grateful that exists too. So that's more than enough. Guys, I want to say thank you to you two for being on this cast and for being so open with your hearts and with your time. And we will talk to you soon. Good thing to mention to everyone who is subscribed to our Talking Bird feed, that podcast, the files from New York City, including Sarah's fantastic talk, which will be a little bit better, I think, once the video comes out. But and all of the talks outside of Alfie Cohn's, which we weren't allowed to post, but they're all up. And go and listen, and there's lots of food for thought. And this is me signing off.
Bye, you guys.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you for listening. Remember, you can find us on the web at www.mbird.com. And we'd always love to hear from you at info@mbird.com. Audio production for the Mockingcast is provided by the Narrativo Group, and if you like what you've heard, please do drop over to iTunes and leave us a rating and review. Until next time.
Praise the Lord.